Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Schenker, Editor-in-Chief of The Innovator, a global publication about innovation and sustainability. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon for this panel on AI for climate adaptation. I'm going to take a minute to frame the issue here. Climate change, you've all seen the images on the nightly news. Climate change is accelerating at an unprecedented pace, and it's likely to continue to do so. In 2022 alone, we've witnessed devastation of floods in Pakistan, severe drought and heat waves in Europe, droughts in Kenya, and catastrophic impact from Hurricane Ian, causing major disruptions around the world. Due to this, we must give climate adaptation and resilience an unprecedented urgency. Not surprisingly, COP27 put climate adaptation and resilience at the forefront of the agenda, acknowledging mitigation is no longer enough. Government and business leaders need to step up and act now. Huge investment is needed for climate adaptation and resilience, especially in the global south, with the need for adaptation and resilience financing expected to reach between $140 billion and $300 billion by 2030 for developing countries alone. And what we'll see is a people cost as well. We will see millions of people having to migrate away from where they live because their homes are no longer inhabitable. Advanced analytics and AI will be key in accelerating efforts and driving cost efficiency through improved climate modeling, hazard projections, and scenario simulations. So this panel is going to address how we're going to do that. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. To my immediate left is Mr. Espen Barth Eide, the Minister of Climate and Environment for Norway. Next to him, we have Pansi Trivisvave, Chief Executive Officer of Inari Agriculture. Next to her, we have Takayuki Morita, the Chief Executive Officer of NEC Corporation, and Phyllis Dar, President and Trustee from the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. So without further ado, let's get into the topic. And let me start with you, Phyllis. What do you see as some primary use cases for AI as applied to climate adaptation?
Oh, that's I'm always somebody who starts from a very optimistic point of view. So I'm very enthusiastic about this question. We're seeing use cases for AI and climate that really transform the relationship between those who are most vulnerable and those who hold the resources that can help them. With support from the private sector, organizations like Google are building more ecologically friendly routing in Google Maps to reduce carbon emissions. In the sector itself, we're seeing organizations that are looking at things like forecasting solar energy needs so that we can better utilize fossil fuel resources. And we're seeing collaborations that are really quite powerful. Organizations like Planet are working with Carbon Mapper to identify methane leaks at macro scale, and then to be able to identify and intervene where we need to. But it's important, Jennifer, that we also have to make sure that we're not overly enthusiastic without also tempering these use cases, right? Where all of these use cases exist, it's important to note that the amount of money that's going into building these positive use cases is dwarfed by the amount of money that's going into using AI for things like increasing the efficiency of fossil fuel extraction or reducing the costs of supply chains. So this conversation comes at a time where we hold not just an optimism about what's possible, but also a moral responsibility to ensure that the investments are going into places and organizations and individuals where they can really have effects on a positive climate future for all of us.
Thank you. Let me now turn to you, Morita, and ask you, what do you see as the principal use cases?
I think the biggest use case we experienced is the disaster prevention and the disaster mitigations by using AI and also the sensors around the world, including satellite and also submarine cables. And also optical fibers. You'd be surprised and how much we are suffering from the disasters and in terms of CO2 emissions. I mean, fires and flood and the tsunami, typhoon, and not including like a cost of reconstructions of infrastructure, the damage itself is probably more than 10% of worldwide emissions is caused by these disasters. And if we can use like a satellite, we can detect like a subtle change of the surface of the land, and also the subtle change of infrastructure, like a bridge and the buildings and so on, so that we can properly prevent like something happens. And also like a submarine cable, and by using a submarine cable, we can detect like tsunami or the large waves, and in a very early stage, so we can evacuate the people from the dangerous places, and also that take proper actions in time. And also, when we are looking at fibers, by using most state-of-the-art technology we are developing in laboratories, and all the fibers laid in today, and potentially detect like the changes of the healthiness of the areas, and also the like sensing the environment, the traffic, and so on. So that by using those and leveraging that data usage, we can prevent and the biggest contributors of these CO2 emissions.
Thank you. This seems like a good place to mention that here at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, the forum announced a global initiative called Fire Aid, which is doing exactly what you've just talked about, trying to prevent, using AI to try to prevent wildfires. And so they've developed algorithms that, when put in place, have something like 80% accuracy in being able to predict where the next wildfire will take place, and then send in the firefighters to take necessary measures before these things start. And as you mentioned, this causes a tremendous amount of emissions, and there's also a huge cost to these kind of natural disasters.
Yeah, and also by taking that preventive maintenance and to the important infrastructures, and we can reduce like reconstruction cost, and we can make the life of the infrastructure much longer. So I think our calculation shows that we can reduce the constructions or maintenance costs by half by maximum using these kind of informations.
Wow, that's super impactful. So let me now turn to you because one of the issues that we have to deal with in climate change is the way we produce food. And so tell us a little bit about what your company is doing and the approach you're taking.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. So we look at the AI in a way that we look at the intersection of AI and biology. And we try to solve the food system challenge. And the definition of food system challenge is not to debate whether we're going to address the challenge of food security or we're going to save the world in terms of sustainability. We believe that these two things can definitely coexist. And we use AI to actually address it at the very beginning of the food chain, which is genetics, which is seeds, which is the little unsung hero. And whether we like it or not, the genomes of the crops are actually more complex than us, meaning the genome of human. Let me give you an example. Wheat genome is actually 5 times more complex than us here. So how much of the knowledge that we know today about the genomes of wheat? So genome of wheat is roughly 100,000. We know today just 50. So think about it as, if we could know more, if we could learn more, what would we do with these genetics? And from there, what we do is, out of the whole company, 1/4 of us are pretty much working on as data scientists or software engineer, trying to understand those and write algorithm to understand complexity of genomes. And once we know it, then we make the changes and we do the multiplex gene editing, CRISPR, and we work on several genes at the same time. But that tool has no meaning if we actually don't know where we go make the changes in a natural way, in a way that we have the insights, and this is really complex stuff, and AI is certainly extremely critical. That's how we use it. So the seeds can take less water, can take less fertilizer, and can take less land, and that's what we are doing.
So there's, an environmental upside, but it also makes our whole food system more resilient.
Correct, exactly.
So let me turn to you now, Minister. What do you see as the use cases and also the role of government in forming the type of collaborations that we need to get this done?
It's an extremely interesting and important subject. And before I answer that excellent question, I just want to say the best thing we can do with the climate is stop emitting. So we never forget that we need to keep mitigating. And adaptation is absolutely necessary, but is not a substitute for harder mitigation. That said, there is a colossal potential, and much has been mentioned. I thought about 4 things just for the beginning. First, of course, it's the ability to predict extreme weather events with much higher accuracy. Satellite monitoring, big data, and AI analysis can now tell you with high degree of precision whether there will be floods or fires, as you mentioned, in the immediate future in order to warn people or take countermeasures, but also in this sort of little bit longer term, so midterm, which is important for planning agricultural stuff, and to pick up new patterns, because everyone in this room was born in the Holocene. We're now in the Anthropocene. We don't really know how it works because it's new. Back in the days, we knew how much snow there would be in Davos for the next annual meeting. There is fortunately snow, but there's no snow anywhere else in Switzerland. We need to find these new patterns, and that will help us. So that's number one. The other one is very much, it's biodiversity loss. We just came out of Montreal on a major agreement on nature. And we need to be better able to understand and monitor the speed of biodiversity loss, of nature loss, which has a lot to do with land use and land use change. Thirdly, as part of mitigation is, of course, to go from a predominantly fossil to a predominantly renewable system. The good news is that renewable energy sources are becoming cheaper and cheaper. What is complicated is that it may be less expensive, but it's more advanced. You need to combine, solar with wind and hydro and storage. So it requires in order to make it effective, so you have 24/7 electricity without burning coal or gas, you can definitely use AI more for optimizing these systems that you invest, because we will not have abundance of energy any longer. We will have to think about how we use it. And the fourth is for policing, is looking after whether countries stick to their promises, because we make a lot of agreements. And we, for instance, are very much involved in helping countries stop deforestation, but we'd like to know whether they actually stop deforestation. And now advanced satellite imagery and advanced analysis will, tell us, and in the end, Interpol and others, whether they're actually behaving according to agreements.
Thank you. So now I'd like to talk about how these efforts need to ultimately empower local problem owners. So how can we make all of this succeed within a national context, and what are some of the challenges that might have to be overcome? And I'll start with you, Willis, because I know this is something close to your heart.
Jennifer, I've been thinking a lot about the Davos moment this week, right? And for many, the Davos moment is some absurd moment where a CEO does something funny or you run into someone. I'll tell you my Davos moment. I'll paraphrase a little bit, but I met this morning a young indigenous woman from Ecuador. And I was speaking with her and I said, what do we really need to do to equip you and your community to defend against climate change? And she said, you don't really need to do much. We're actually already pretty great stewards. But if you could stop the global north from coming and cutting down our trees, that would be pretty great. You know, it's such an insightful moment as we think about how biocultural stewards across the world are already defending against climate. And I tie it back to the AI construct and thinking about how we have frontline defenders of our nature, our biocultural diversity. One of the things we've seen recently is organizations coming forward to build AI solutions that better equip these individuals to fight against illegal poaching or illegal logging. But what's happened that's been quite instructive is those technology solutions can't be built in a vacuum. They have to be built with a local knowledge and an understanding of what it means to really go out every single day, to try to interdict illegal poachers, to put yourself at risk, and to know what information you need when, so that you can be safe but deeply effective about it. That young woman who shared that to me represents 3 populations that are each left out of this conversation. The first is indigenous people across the world who have such a deep knowledge of the environments they operate in, of the environments they protect. And yet we rarely see conversations of indigenous people who are brought into the rooms where technology is developed. Second is women and girls. There's plenty of research and data that shows that women and girls will be particularly over-affected by climate. And yet we see that the population that's creating AI at any level, whether in the corporate world or in the work that we do, has just a significant and very sad underrepresentation of women and girls. And the third, to just take it out to the macro, is what I call the global majority, not the global south. Those individuals that are, again, at the front lines of vulnerability on weather, on long-term agricultural issues, on the economic impacts of climate. And yet a recent study from BCG showed that 80% of the AI solutions that have been built over the last few years to affect the SDGs were created in the global north. What does it mean when the distance to the resources, the tools, the software, the AI that can solve your problems is so far away from your lived experience? Well, we know that doesn't work. So we have to come up with new ways to bring these populations not merely into being technology creators, but rather to take technology and turn it into a service that lets these populations do what they already do naturally to protect our planet.
Super interesting. And, you know, this will require designing tools that are fueled with data about the local issues on the ground. And this is true even for fighting wildfires. You know, if you develop an algorithm for one area, it won't necessarily work in another region. So we need data, and we need it to be local. And I think that's a good segue for you to talk about the whole issue of data in developing solutions for climate adaptation.
Yes, I think the biggest obstacles or like the demotivating, like this kind of moves is kind of regulations and unclear regulations on the use of the data, on the moving the data. And sometimes we can't move the data from the one country to the other. Even that is a kind of a training data. And I think we really need to have a common understandings how we can use and how we can share those data for the common purpose.
Yeah.
Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, exactly. Before we can even talk about AI, the basic thing is data.
Yeah.
And especially from the part where I'm coming from, certainly it's a challenge when we talk about genetics of the plants in terms of availability of the data. Certainly it's limited. When you talk about the data, when you have the consumer data, there's a lot of them. You can actually get it from the website. Actually, in fact, when you talk about human health, there are a lot of data as well. If you go back to the DeepMind, I think most of you have heard about DeepMind before. In fact, there are a lot of more than 100,000 proteins, data of protein already exist that the National Cancer Institute invested in. So these are all available to actually enable the AI. But when it comes to the life of the planet, which all of us share, how much have we been investing into the data of life, into the data of life of planet? And I would say that it is less than 0.1%. So the call for action is, how do we think differently as the whole private-public sector. Private sector, do we share to each other more? Public sector is that investment into the data of the life of the planet more in terms of the genetics of the plants? Do we actually incentivize the farmers more to actually share this kind of data? Because all of us, we have to keep this planet, and we have more generations to come, and in fact, we have less than one lifetime to actually solve this problem. So data for genetics is a serious one in terms of the life of the planet.
Thank you. Minister, what's your
No.
take?
Yeah, no, I think this is data. First, it's true even with AI that, shit in and shit out. If the data is bad, the outcome is not useful. So you need to have very solid data. You need to look into data quality, data integrity, sharing, which is both about the will to share, but also if it's shareable. If the coding and so on makes it shareable. But these, and we really need to do more here. I was struck by reflecting on the other day that, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we were 800 million people. And now we are 8 billion, right? So 10 times more, thanks to productivity growth. But we still have a perception of the world that we have few people on the big planet. The reality is that we are a lot of people on a small planet. We can live with that, but we need to think about all these things much, much better, to use resources smarter, understand how we interact with other types of life and so on. So that requires, of course, a lot of scientific data that biologists or so on have to produce, but then we need to be able to analyze them on a big scale. So I think there's a tremendous potential now that we are actually trying to understand the living world around us. And I want to mention one ecosystem which is the biggest on the planet, but the least understood, which is the ocean. And now there has been, for a few years, a growth in the interest in nature in addition to climate. It's not only about emissions, it's about biodiversity at large. But it took quite a long time because people remembered that most of that biodiversity, actually, the almost 90% is in the ocean. And there's now a Norwegian initiative trying to collect data collect existing and create new ocean-related data and making it broadly available, Hub Ocean, which is precisely in order to have a repository of data that can be used by people who want to get better knowledge of how we interact with the ocean ecosystem.
So let me ask you a follow-up question. Looking ahead, what do you think can and should be done to drive more public-private collaboration to fix all of these problems that we've just discussed?
So what I think is quite encouraging is that it seems that there is a broad agreement, for instance here, but in many other circles like the ones we meet in Davos, that the green transition is actually the growth motor of the future. So it's not only something you need to do to save the planet, but it's also where new opportunities exist. Then there's also a coming stream of work looking into this, again, not only as emission reduction, but also as a better interaction with resources, smarter use, recycling, reuse, a more circular economy. So there's something there, but we governments need to, both support the development of the new and better stuff. We need to punish what we want to have less of, to carbon pricing and so on. And we need to sort of create enabling environments for a speedier uptake of a more circular, more renewable, and more sort of nature-conscious economy across the board. And then, a lot of business leaders and investors and innovators are already thinking of what the answers are, but we need to make sure that this economy makes more sense than the linear and fossil economy we have to leave behind. And I think that there is that requires a lot. There's many answers to that, and not all of them are AI, but I think big data and AI used for good purposes is a big part of that, because we need simply to get smarter, and then we need to be smarter as humans, but we also need to use the machines we invented to help us to be smart, in the meaning, optimizing use of whatever we have, energy, resources.
How is your government organizing itself to be able to enable all of this? Like, if these innovators come up with the right tools to help your country with things like wildfires or floods or anything else, who do they connect into in the government? Is there a special agency or person? Is this something that is even on the radar? And I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I think this is something that every government now has to be thinking about and figuring out, how they connect into this whole systemic change.
So first answer is we're not good enough, right? Nor we are not, and the others aren't either. So it's not only us. I mean, none of us are good enough at this. We have to do it better. But we are beginning to look at sort of more innovative tools where we can go in with sort of early technology support for ideas that look promising. Maybe look at whether we can have whether it's direct stimulus or tax breaks or other kinds of stimulus to make these new things sort of grow faster. And often it is about, sometimes it's about permitting, sometimes it's about direct support, sometimes taxation, changing all models that used to be good but not so good any longer, and also to connect different parts of an ecosystem. And now I speak about economic ecosystem, that different parts of a value chain. And I think that is something that we're trying to get better at, trying to work more whole of government, more across, and inviting relevant private sector actors to help us think about, what could a better government to promote these purposes look like, and what are the things they would like to change. That's what we call climate partnerships, and eventually this will also become more like nature partnerships with business.
Okay, super. So what do you see as the, what is needed to drive these new types of partnerships?
So I mentioned about it earlier, that Jennifer, that the piece around the data, and Minister talked about it a lot, that from the private sector, we need to actually think about how are we willing to actually work with one another that won't jeopardize the competitiveness, but there's a basic thing that we can share with one another. And then from the public sector, that when I heard about what you just said, that's exactly right. The policy that is not only about penalizing, but also benefiting, and also the investment. So you have 3 columns over there, depending on the subjects that part of the policy maker there. And certainly, I wish that we could have more of. We don't have that kind of community to talk about the data, the genetics of the life of the planet yet. And I hope that that could be something new that we could consider to talk, whether that would be World Economic Forum could actually started that initiative. So that could be something new that we could think about.
Can I just quickly,
Sure,
I think what your theme is very central to this, because it will be warmer and it will be drier. And in some places it will be wetter as well, but too wet, right?
Yes.
So we will have a water problem. We will have either too much or too little. And we really need to work up front, because we'd like these 8 billion people to eat every day, right? So we really have to do some upfront innovation in order to have the right seeds and so on.
Exactly. Can I build on that? That what we shouldn't do is actually the mitigation. What we should do is prevention. Yeah. So when it comes to this point, then we can't just invest and say that, okay, where we are right now with the temperature, where we are right now in losing water, where we are right now in terms of runoff, that too is easy enough to monitor, but how do you prevent those, right? Reality of agriculture is 20% of the greenhouse gas emission. Reality is agriculture is 70% of fresh water consumption. How do you actually invest into the data and come up with a solution to prevent that problem?
Thank you.
I visited, I'm sorry, I visited, it so happened that a week ago I visited a medium-sized Norwegian town to look at what they did with their water supply. And they told me enthusiastically they had started buying a lot of sensors, which were not expensive. There were supply side problems because everything is low now, but quite cheap. And this data would tell them in a much better way, in the long run, also much cheaper way, earlier, if there was, a sort of a shortage problem coming up, or where there was a surplus problem coming up, and they thought they would now be much better in managing water. And this was not something we told them to do. They found out this is actually smarter than having people walking around looking at this all the time in a high-cost country that's quite expensive. So they were sort of looking, and they spoke about it as an AI opportunity, that, when things are running fine. The system tells you everything is green, and if not, they tell you early before you can see it with your own eyes. It's a small practical management problem.
So thank you for that example, Minister. And let me turn to you, Marina. What kind of collaborations is NAC making in this area, and what would you like to see?
Yeah, we NEC is doing a lot of the public-private partnerships. For example, we have an agreement with Kawasaki City in Tokyo, and to promote and disaster resilient city. So they are kind of sharing the vision of the future, and also the encouraging social acceptance of investing into that field. And then we are kind of acting as a kind of technologist partners to realize it. I think those kind of activities is really important to get acceptance by the society. That is very important. But at the same time, I think more broadly, in order to promote these types of initiative, I think we should think about how we can measure a social impact by this kind of use of the AI. And then, in other words, we are talking about reduction of the CO2 emission in the future, right? So if we can have a clear calculations or the impact by taking actions, probably that should be read into the real future reduction of the emission. And in other words, I'm talking about incentives or finance to encourage the people to do so. And probably we could think about, if everything goes well, we could think about a credit type of things. And then investing into that the preventive things, and then they are getting some credit and using it. That kind of things. That's the idea. But
it's super interesting, and having that precise data would be very helpful, especially since, and I think we just need to at least mention in passing, that there are concerns about the amount of energy and emissions from technology itself. Yeah. So we need to be able to show that whatever energy we use in the AI to tackle the problem is much less than the upside. So it'll be important to have that data. Let me turn to you now, Vilas.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Morita-san, I think that point is so important. To just frame it a different way, I have the privilege of being married to a very brilliant behavioral scientist. And Julia, along with, teaching me lots about the world, often shows me that solutions that are built in really complex ways and have lots of policy behind them and lots of data fail at the point of implementation because we forgot to understand the people that are supposed to use them. And I think this point is right at the core of it. It also illustrates the challenge of the question. We have amazing scientists and technologists around the world that can build great solutions. Often they start from defining a problem in numerical ways. They think about building machine learning models and algorithms that allow you to find efficiencies. They often work with governments to build policies around them. Without civil society at the table that's often advocating for the people at the front lines of vulnerability, we sometimes miss a trick. There aren't many institutions that bridge the civil society technology gap. Our institution attempts to do that at the Patrick McGovern Foundation, but more than doing it ourselves, one of the commitments we've made is to really try to build an ecosystem of civil society partners that have access to the fundamental tools, the compute necessary to build some of the models, as you just spoke to, understanding the environmental consequences of some of the compute itself, access to the data. Nonprofit organizations around the world are incredible stewards of data, reaching back many, many years because they've been at the front lines of these problems. And sometimes instead of starting over to try to create really clean data, what we need to do is understand not just the data, but the wisdom that's been attached to it as we try to create AI solutions. So I think this idea of partnerships isn't just a nice to have. You know, we announced here at the forum this week a new collaboration of philanthropists coming together to unlock capital called Gaia around climate solutions. But one of the comments that I made in that conversation was capital doesn't solve the problem alone. Scientific capacity doesn't solve the problem alone. At the heart of all of it is a trust between institutions across different sectors and trust in the communities that have to deploy the solutions. I think if we can get there, then all of a sudden we can come back and talk about each particular solution, but we can also build an incredible ecosystem of new inspirational answers.
Fabulous. So if there's one thing that you would like the people in the room to take away from today's session, what would that be?
Well, like I said, I'm an optimist. I mean, we have an incredible opportunity to use AI to solve a challenge that truly is global. But it doesn't happen without an intentional start to make sure that we center both the people and their dignity and the planet and make sure that the solutions are built for that purpose.
Thank you. Marina, what would you like people to take away?
I think once everybody understands the value of these adaptations, I think we can solve the issue we are facing right now. It's a kind of how we can share the data and also how we can incentivize the people to take actions.
Thank you. Pansy.
Yeah, if we could turn it by using the data of life to solve the problem of the planet life, and by changing the situation of whereby agriculture is contributing to 20% of the problem, can we be audacious? Can we have audacious goal that agriculture would contribute to 80% of the solutions? Do not think about net zero, think about net positive, think about nature positive. And I would like to leave it with everyone to aim high and aim nature positive outcome.
Thank you. Minister.
So I'm also fundamentally an optimist, but I also want to say that we need to, what we're really talking about here is we still have to make choices, and the choices will be tough. And they're going to get tougher because there is a resource constraint, and there is a trouble in having enough food, and the planet is heating, and areas will be unlivable. So we're going to make some very tough choices. What data and AI can help us with, if it's well done, is to make better choices, which reduces how bad they are, right? But that's it. I mean, it's really we still have to. It's not like a panacea that will fix all problems on the planet, but it will help inform policy making, whether it's private sector or public sector or global or local, so that we better manage with the world that is changing very fast around us. And I very much believe that technology will help, but it still requires human agency to be able to make those political choices, those distributive choices about justice and fairness, and you know, who's going to take the burden of the choices that we still have to make.
Thank you. And I think that's a perfect point in our discussion to bring in Kay Firth Butterfield, who is heading the forum's efforts on AI and climate adaptation. Kay, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining this session. And perhaps we could give a big hand to our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much. So it's just my opportunity to tell you a little bit about where the forum is going with climate adaptation and artificial intelligence. First thing I wanted to say is, to Vilas's point, we are proud to be part of a conference that's going to take place, bringing indigenous people together from around the world and thinking about how we can better use AI to serve their needs and to learn from them. So that's one thing that we will be doing very soon. Second thing I just wanted to mention, some of you in the audience might not know that we have a Centers for the Fourth Industrial Revolution around the world. So when we are thinking about work that we're doing. We're including all of those. There are now 18 of them. And Ocean Hub, which the Minister mentioned, is just one of those.
That's right.
And then to the work that we will actually be doing, we've already done some work, as Jennifer said, around fire aid. And I just want to, which is predicting where wildfires will happen 24 hours, up to 24 hours before they do. So stopping the fires before they start. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the community that we built in order to do that. There were a lot of companies who had technical expertise that they brought to the table, but also companies that are suffering from this. So, for example, we have a company in South Africa that's mining and minerals company, but they own a lot of land and they have a lot of wildfire problems. And so it's really bringing the technologists, the people who are stewards of the land together with the governments, and as Vilas so well put it, not only the people who live locally, but also the people who, the non-profits working in those areas. And so what the way forward with this particular work is at the instigation on Monday of the Chief Scientist of Australia, we are going to set up a coalition of best practices around wildfires, because unfortunately, although the solution that we've been working on fits the Mediterranean, it doesn't fit other areas. And so the consensus was what we need to do is to bring everybody in the globe who's suffering from these wildfires together to share learnings, best practices, and access to some of the technology that might help. So thank you very much for joining us, and I will let you go to your evening meetings now. Thank you.
Thank you.